Settle in, breathe deep, and let the sounds of the ancient world wash over you. Tonight, we journey back thousands of years to the heart of the Mediterranean, to a story so vast, so powerful, it still shapes our world today. Close your eyes and imagine a tiny village on 7 small hills that grew into the greatest empire the West has ever known, a place of mighty armies, golden emperors, and legendary laws. This is the complete story of Rome, from its mythic birth to its inevitable fading. Let the history of the Caesars, the soldiers, and the citizens guide you into a deep, restful sleep. We begin at the very start, in a land of shepherds and ancient prophecy. Welcome to History for the Tired. Our story begins long, long ago in ancient Italy, a place of rolling green hills, slow rivers, and quiet forests. Before Rome was a great city, it was just a dream, wrapped in a legend about 2 special twin boys, Romulus and Remus. Their story is dramatic and a little sad, but it is the key to understanding how this mighty civilization believed it started. The twins were said to be the sons of the war god Mars and a royal princess. Because of a wicked king, they were abandoned as babies near the Tiber River, left to the mercy of the wild. But destiny had a different plan for them, one that involved a strange and miraculous adoption that would become the most famous symbol of Rome. In the quiet wilderness, the twins were discovered by a she-wolf, a fierce and maternal animal. This wolf nursed the tiny boys, protecting them and keeping them warm until a shepherd finally found them and took them home to raise them. Imagine that image, the strong wolf, a symbol of primal power, caring for the future founders of a legendary empire. The brothers grew up strong, brave, and natural leaders. They were not satisfied with the simple life of shepherds. As young men, they decided to build a new town where they had been saved, right next to the 7 small hills that rose above the river. This spot was strategically perfect for a future city, offering natural defenses and a view of the river traffic. However, like many great partnerships, the brothers eventually disagreed. When it came time to choose the exact location and name the new city, they quarreled. They turned to signs from the gods, watching the flight of the vultures, a process known as auspices. Remus saw his sign first on one hill, but Romulus saw more birds later on a different hill, the Palatine. They argued over which sign was true and who was the true founder. In a fit of anger and passion, Romulus marked out his city walls. When Remus mocked him and leapt over the low barrier, a tragic fight broke out. In that violent moment, Romulus killed his brother Remus. It was a terrible foundational tragedy. Legend says that Romulus then declared, "So perish everyone that shall hereafter leap over my walls." This act set a dark tone for Rome, a city born from fraternity and then blood, placing the defense of the city above all else, even family. Romulus named the new settlement Roma, or Rome, after himself. He became its first king, ruling not over a democratic city, but over a small, humble kingdom. To populate his new town, he had to welcome all sorts of people, refugees, runaway slaves, and men seeking a fresh start. The early days of the Roman kingdom, which began in what historians traditionally date as 753 BC, were simple but tough. The city was a blend of different peoples, and it was ruled by a monarchy. The king had great power, but he also had to listen to a council of elders known as the Senate, a word that comes from the Latin word for old man. The king was a military leader, a judge, and the head of the religion. After Romulus, Rome had 6 more kings. These kings, some wise, some warlike, some good builders, helped Rome grow from a village into a small, regionally important city. They built walls, drains, and the first major temples. This era of the kings lasted for over 240 years. The last of these kings, Tarquin the Proud, was said to be a tyrant, a cruel, selfish ruler who abused his power and the people. The Roman people, who valued liberty and hated arrogance, finally had enough. Their dislike for kings became a central part of their identity. The story of Tarquin's expulsion is the final essential step in Rome's birth story. It's the moment they decided they would never again trust one man with absolute power. With a great push, they threw out the last king and declared a completely new form of government, one that would define them for centuries. It was the end of the kings and the beginning of the Roman Republic. With the wicked king Tarquin finally gone, the Romans made a solemn promise. Never again would a single person rule them. They deeply feared the idea of a king and called the new system the Republic, which means public affair or thing of the people. This was an incredible moment in world history, a daring experiment in shared power. Instead of one king, they decided to elect 2 leaders every year, who they called consuls. These consuls were like temporary presidents and military generals combined, and the fact that there were 2 of them was crucial. The main idea behind having 2 consuls was checks and balances. If one consul wanted to do something, the other consul could say veto, a Latin word that means I forbid. This meant power was always split and monitored, and the consuls were the executive branch making things happen, but they had to answer to the most powerful group in the city, the Senate. The Senate was made up of older, experienced men, usually from the wealthiest and most important families, called the patricians. But the Roman world was not equal. The powerful, noble families were the patricians, who held almost all the political and religious power. Everyone else, the farmers, the merchants, the craftsmen, and the soldiers, were called the plebeians. For many years, the patricians made the laws and ran the government, often benefiting themselves. The plebeians grew angry and demanded a say. This struggle between the 2 groups is called the conflict of the orders, and it was the central drama of the early republic. The plebeians finally reached a breaking point. In a momentous act, they performed a secession. They simply packed up and marched out of Rome, refusing to fight in the army or work the land. They threatened to start their own city on a nearby hill. The patricians quickly realized that without the plebeians, Rome was defenseless and empty. To bring them back, the patricians had to compromise and create a new office, specially for the common people: the tribune of the plebs. The tribunes were sacrosanct, meaning they were untouchable and sacred. No one could lay a hand on them while they were in office. They were given the power of the absolute veto against any law or action that they felt harmed the plebeian people. This was a huge step for democracy. Suddenly, the common people had powerful protectors within the government. This dramatic struggle and compromise showed that Rome was a flexible and practical society, able to change its laws to keep its citizens united. The result was a complex, powerful government that balanced the aristocracy with the voice of the people. The Senate handled the big questions of war and finance, the consuls led the armies, and the tribunes defended the rights of the common person. It was a messy, loud system, full of debate and argument, but it worked. This system of the Roman Republic would last for nearly 500 years, growing from a small city-state into the dominant power in Italy, ready to face the world. The foundations were set, and the legions were ready to march. The success of the early Roman Republic wasn't just about armies and generals. It was built on something much firmer: law. Before the laws were written down, they were only known by the patricians, the wealthy, noble families. This meant that when a patrician judge ruled on a case, the plebeians, the common people, often felt they were treated unfairly because they didn't know the rules. It felt like the law was being changed just to suit the rich. This created deep suspicion and anger, threatening to tear the young republic apart again. The plebeians demanded that the laws be codified, written down for all to see. They wanted a public, permanent record of their rights and duties. After intense political pressure, the government finally agreed. Around 450 BC, a committee was formed to write down the core laws of Rome. The result was a collection of rules known as the 12 Tables. These were literally 12 bronze or wooden tablets placed in the main public square, the forum, for everyone to read, rich or poor. This act of writing down the law was revolutionary. It meant that the law was now public. It was no longer a secret weapon of the powerful. The 12 tables covered everything from property rights and debt to marriage and punishments. It established the idea that a citizen was innocent until proven guilty and that everyone was subject to the same rules, at least in theory. This foundation of law would become Rome's longest-lasting legacy, influencing legal systems across Europe and the entire Western world for thousands of years. Now let's look at the heart of early Roman life, the family. The Roman family was structured around the paterfamilias, which literally means father of the family. This was the oldest living male, and he had enormous legal power over his entire household, which included his wife, children, slaves, and property. This authority was called patria potestas, father's power. He had control over his children's lives and marriages, and even their property until he died. This extreme respect for the head of the family showed how much Romans valued order and hierarchy. The central values of Roman society were wrapped up in a word: pietas. This doesn't mean piety in the religious sense alone, but a profound, dutiful respect for authority. It meant respect for the gods, respect for the state, and absolute respect for your family, especially the paterfamilias. Another key value was gravitas, which meant seriousness, duty, and deep moral purpose. A good Roman was serious, hard-working, and always put the needs of the republic and his family before his own personal desires. These simple but powerful laws and values helped create a society ready for growth. The laws ensured internal stability and fairness, while the values of discipline, duty, and seriousness filled the ranks of the Roman army. The plebeians had gained their rights, the laws were written down, and the whole city was united under a system that valued the republic above all else. With this legal and moral foundation set, Rome was no longer just a struggling city-state. It was a disciplined, organized power, ready to march out of its 7 hills and begin its conquest of the rest of Italy. The era of internal conflict was settling, and the age of external expansion was beginning. Once Rome had sorted out its laws and government, it looked outwards. The neighbors, however, were not friendly. Rome was surrounded by other Italian tribes, all competing for the best farmland and power. The most important early challenge came from the Latin League, a group of cities in the region near Rome, who were wary of the city's growing strength. The Romans, with their disciplined army and fierce sense of pietas, duty to the state, met this challenge head-on. The conflict with the Latin League was essentially a civil war among closely related people. Rome was successful, not just by winning battles, but by being smart about peace. When Rome conquered a city, they didn't just punish it, they offered them citizenship. Some conquered people were given full Roman citizenship, which included the right to vote and hold office. Others received partial citizenship, which protected their legal rights but didn't allow them to vote. This policy of offering citizenship to former enemies was a stroke of genius. It meant that every time Rome won a war, it didn't just gain land, it gained new, loyal soldiers who saw Rome as their city. This constant increase in manpower and loyalty made Rome's army virtually unstoppable. They turned conquered lands not into bitter subjects, but into committed allies, ready to fight for the Republic. This was the key difference between Rome and other ancient powers. After securing the Latin lands, Rome faced a tougher enemy in the mountainous central region of Italy, the Samnites. These were tough, fierce, and independent tribes who were masters of mountain warfare. Fighting the Samnites was much harder than fighting the flatland city-states. The wars with them, known as the Samnite Wars, stretched over 50 long years. These were brutal, drawn-out conflicts that forced the Roman army to adapt and improve its tactics. The legions learned to fight in smaller, more flexible units called maniples, rather than one huge, clumsy line. This tactical change allowed them to maneuver much better in the rugged terrain. These wars were Rome's military academy, forging their army into the most efficient fighting force of the ancient world. They learned that perseverance and adaptability were more important than sheer strength. By the time the dust settled, Rome had control of nearly the entire Italian peninsula, stretching from the northern plains down to the heel of the boot. They did this through a blend of military might, clever diplomacy, and the brilliant promise of Roman citizenship. Rome was now the undisputed master of Italy. However, by taking control of the entire Italian coastline, Rome was about to bump up against a much larger, wealthier, and more sophisticated power across the sea, the great trading empire of Carthage. Their long, terrible struggle was about to begin. As Rome sat on the southern tip of Italy, it looked across a narrow strip of water to the island of Sicily. Right there, and across the entire western Mediterranean, was the shadow of Carthage. Carthage was a wealthy city in North Africa, originally founded by Phoenician sailors, and it controlled a massive trading empire. They had a huge navy, countless gold, and vast trading routes. To the Romans, who were mostly farmers, Carthage seemed incredibly rich and powerful. The problem was that Rome's expansion in Italy and Carthage's control of the seas made a clash inevitable. The spark was Sicily. Both powers saw the fertile island as vital. When a local squabble broke out on the island, both Rome and Carthage rushed in to help one side or the other, pretending to be allies, but secretly planning to seize control. This led directly to the start of the First Punic War in 264 BC. The term Punic comes from the Latin word for the Carthaginians, who were descendants of the Phoenicians. This war was a brutal, drawn-out affair that lasted for 23 long years. It was primarily a war at sea, and this presented a huge problem for Rome. Rome's strength was its legions, its foot soldiers, but Carthage was the unquestioned queen of the waves, with a navy built over centuries. Rome needed ships, and fast. In a testament to their practicality and determination, the Romans quickly copied a captured Carthaginian ship and, in an astonishing feat, built a massive fleet from scratch in just a few months. But they knew they couldn't beat the Carthaginians at traditional naval tactics. So, they invented a clever device called the corvus, or crow. This was a long wooden plank with a sharp spike on the end, attached to the bow of their ship. When a Roman ship came close to an enemy vessel, the corvus would drop. The spike would impale the enemy deck, and the Roman soldiers would storm across like a bridge. They had turned a naval battle into a land battle. This brilliant innovation neutralized Carthage's superior sailing skills and allowed the Roman soldier to do what he did best, fight hand to hand. Despite terrible losses, including entire fleets destroyed by storms, Roman persistence eventually won the day. After 2 decades of grueling combat, Carthage was exhausted and sued for peace. Rome won Sicily, the first piece of land outside of Italy, and forced Carthage to pay a huge sum of money. Rome was now a major Mediterranean power, but this first conflict was just the opening act. The deep resentment and anger in Carthage, particularly in the family of the general who lost, guaranteed a much fiercer second act. The great shadow of Hannibal was already rising. The defeat in the First Punic War left a deep, burning desire for revenge in Carthage. This feeling was most intense in the heart of a young man named Hannibal Barca, who as a child had been made to swear an oath to his father that he would always be an enemy of Rome. Hannibal grew up to be one of the greatest military geniuses in all of history, a brilliant commander who understood strategy better than any Roman general of his time. In 218 BC, Hannibal started the Second Punic War with a spectacular act of defiance. He gathered a huge army, including infantry, cavalry, and even several war elephants. Then, instead of sailing, he marched them across Spain, over the massive Alps mountains, and directly into Italy. This was an astonishing, nearly impossible feat. The journey cost him half his army and most of his elephants, but the survivors appeared in Italy, ready to fight, where Rome least expected them. For the Romans, this was a disaster. Hannibal's army began to win one crushing victory after another. At the Battle of Lake Trasimene, Hannibal ambushed a Roman army in a morning mist, trapping and slaughtering nearly all of them. The panic in Rome was immense. The Senate appointed a temporary dictator, Fabius Maximus, whose strategy was to avoid a direct fight, simply following Hannibal and destroying his supplies. The Romans called him the Delayer, but his cautious strategy helped Rome recover. However, the Roman people grew impatient with Fabius's slow war. They demanded a direct confrontation to drive Hannibal out. In 216 BC, they gathered their largest army ever, perhaps 80,000 men, and met Hannibal at the infamous Battle of Cannae. Hannibal, despite having fewer men, used a brilliant, unique tactic. He allowed his center to slowly give ground, creating a crescent shape that drew the Romans deeper into a trap. As the Romans surged forward, Hannibal's elite cavalry and flanks suddenly wheeled around and encircled the entire Roman army. It was a perfect, deadly trap. The result was the most catastrophic defeat in Roman history. Up to 70,000 Roman soldiers were killed in a single day, a staggering number that shook the Republic to its core. Many of Rome's allies left them, and the fate of the city seemed sealed. Yet, even with victory after victory, Hannibal never attacked the city of Rome itself. He believed Rome would surrender after such a loss, but the Romans simply refused to give up. They rebuilt their armies, using every available citizen, even slaves. Hannibal remained in Italy for over a decade, ruling parts of the south, but he could not break the Roman spirit. The Romans had learned a painful lesson. Their legions were good, but their enemy was a genius. They needed a genius of their own to beat him, and a young general was preparing to rise. After the disaster at Cannae, Rome needed a new hero, someone brave and clever enough to challenge Hannibal. That person was Publius Cornelius Scipio, a young general who had witnessed the horror of Cannae but refused to be broken by it. Scipio decided on a daring, game-changing strategy. Instead of fighting Hannibal in Italy, he would invade Carthage's home territory in North Africa. This brilliant move had two effects. First, it forced the Carthaginian Senate to panic and order Hannibal to finally leave Italy to defend his own city. The great general's 15-year stay in Italy was over. Second, it allowed Scipio to forge a crucial alliance with the Numidians, a powerful local cavalry force in North Africa who hated the Carthaginians. Scipio quickly gained the nickname Africanus for his victories in Africa. The stage was set for the final, great confrontation. In 202 BC, Hannibal and Scipio finally met at the Battle of Zama in North Africa. It was a meeting between two legendary commanders, each leading a desperate army. Hannibal still had his war elephants, but Scipio was ready for them. He arranged his legions in columns with wide gaps, turning the rampaging elephants into a harmless force that simply ran through the lines. Scipio also cleverly countered Hannibal's superior cavalry by using his own new Numidian allies to drive them off the field. The infantry battle was hard fought, with both sides pushing fiercely. But Scipio's final tactic was decisive. He pretended to pull back his front lines, then swiftly regrouped his troops into a fresh, solid formation, pushing the weary Carthaginian forces to their breaking point. Hannibal's army was completely defeated at Zama. It was a crushing loss that ended the Second Punic War immediately. Carthage was forced to accept a humiliating peace treaty. They had to give up all their territories outside of Africa, surrender their entire fleet, and pay an enormous sum of money to Rome. Most importantly, they were forbidden from waging any war without Rome's permission. The victory secured Rome's place as the supreme power in the Western Mediterranean, but even this was not enough for some Romans. A powerful statesman named Cato the Elder famously ended every speech in the Senate, no matter the topic, with the chilling phrase, "Carthage must be destroyed." 50 years later, Rome picked a final fight, completely leveled the city of Carthage, and ended the Punic threat forever. The Mediterranean became, as the Romans would eventually call it, Mare Nostrum, our sea. With Carthage defeated, Rome's gaze turned eastward, toward the beautiful, ancient lands of Greece. Unlike the Punic Wars, which were a fight for survival, the wars against Greece were more about control, prestige, and influence. Greece, the home of philosophy, democracy, and classical art, was politically divided after the death of Alexander the Great. Its city-states and kingdoms were weak, and Rome eventually felt compelled to step in. The Macedonian Wars were a series of conflicts fought against the successor kingdoms of Alexander. Rome, with its relentless legions, slowly but surely defeated the Greek armies. The Romans were seen as liberators at first, bringing freedom to Greek cities from their Macedonian rulers. But Rome's idea of freedom quickly turned into Roman control. Once the legions arrived, they rarely ever left. The decisive defeat of the Greek forces meant that by 146 BC, the same year Carthage was destroyed, Greece was fully under Roman rule. Rome was now an empire in practice, controlling all the lands around the Mediterranean. However, this conquest was unique because in a strange twist of history, the conquered culture ended up conquering the conquerors. The Romans were brilliant engineers and soldiers, but they lacked a deep culture of their own compared to the Greeks. When the Romans arrived in Greece, they were instantly captivated by its beauty and sophistication. They began to import Greek statues, hire Greek tutors for their children, and adopt Greek philosophy. The Roman rich became obsessed with everything Hellenic, Greek. Greek ideas transformed Rome. The Romans already had their practical gods, but they adopted the sophisticated Greek pantheon, simply giving the gods Roman names. Zeus became Jupiter, Ares became Mars. Roman literature and drama were directly modelled on Greek forms. This mixing of cultures created the Greco-Roman world, a seamless blend of Roman law and military organization with Greek art, philosophy, and learning. While Rome governed the world, Greek culture provided the intellectual and artistic spirit of the empire. This cultural infusion was far more important than any military victory. It created a richer, deeper civilization. However, all the wealth and slaves flowing into Rome from these conquests were beginning to strain the simple, old laws of the Republic. The Republic was strong enough to conquer the world, but it was not strong enough to govern itself justly afterward. The seeds of internal destruction were being sown. After conquering the Mediterranean, Rome became incredibly rich, but this wealth wasn't shared equally. The successful wars had destroyed the farms of many small-time Roman soldiers who were away fighting for years. When they returned, they found their land ruined, or worse, bought up cheaply by rich senators who were creating huge estates called latifundia, run by masses of slaves captured in the wars. This created two massive problems. First, it made the poor people in Rome miserable and angry, creating a huge jobless mob in the city. Second, it reduced the number of property-owning citizens eligible to serve in the army, since only landowners could traditionally be soldiers. The backbone of the Republic, the independent farmer soldier, was disappearing. The government desperately needed reform. Into this crisis stepped two brothers from a wealthy family, the Gracchi. They were brilliant, fiery, and deeply devoted to the common people. The older brother, Tiberius Gracchus, was elected as a tribune in 133 BC. He proposed a revolutionary idea: take back the vast amounts of public land illegally held by the rich and redistribute it in small plots to the poor, landless citizens. This land reform was violently opposed by the rich senators, who saw Tiberius as a dangerous revolutionary threatening their wealth and power. When Tiberius tried to bypass the Senate to pass his law, it was seen as an attack on the ancient traditions of the Republic. In a shocking act of political violence, the Senate and their followers attacked Tiberius and killed him, along with 300 of his supporters, using chairs and clubs. A decade later, his younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, took up the same cause. He was even more radical, pushing for more land reform, cheap grain for the city poor, and extending citizenship to Rome's Italian allies. Like his brother, he earned the bitter hatred of the Senate, who feared his popularity and power. The Senate declared martial law and sent forces after Gaius. When he and his followers were cornered, Gaius chose to have a loyal slave kill him rather than be captured. The Senate then executed thousands of his supporters. The tragic story of the Gracchi brothers showed that the deep problems of the Republic could no longer be solved by peaceful debate. The rich were now willing to use violence and murder to stop reforms, proving that the rule of law was breaking down. The way was being cleared for military strongmen to take power. After the Gracchi brothers, the Republic entered a new, dangerous era where political power shifted from the Senate floor to the battlefield. The new political players were powerful, ambitious generals, and the first great rivalry was between Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Marius was a brilliant military man. a novus homo, a new man from outside the traditional Roman noble families. He became famous by winning tough wars in North Africa and against German tribes. Marius fundamentally changed the Roman army. Before Marius, only men who owned property could serve. Marius opened the army to the landless poor. He promised them a good wage, all the spoils of war, and most importantly, land after they finished their service. These soldiers were no longer loyal to the Republic. They were fiercely loyal to Marius, the man who guaranteed their future. This was a critical and fatal shift for the Republic. While Marius was a popular hero, Sulla was an aristocratic patrician, a successful but intensely ruthless general. Their rivalry came to a head when the Senate gave Sulla command of an important war in the east. Marius, jealous and ambitious, used his political connections to get Sulla's command taken away and given to himself. Sulla was furious at this insult. In an act that shattered every Roman tradition, Sulla marched his loyal army on the city of Rome itself. No general was ever supposed to lead their army inside the sacred city limits. Marius and his supporters fled. Sulla took control, declared his enemies outlaws, and then went off to fight his war in the east. This was the Republic's first taste of a private army controlling the state. While Sulla was away, Marius returned with his own army, seized Rome, and launched a brutal wave of revenge killings against Sulla's supporters. The city was a terrifying place, with political opponents executed daily. This back-and-forth violence showed how completely the rule of law had collapsed. The state was now a prize to be won by the general with the strongest, most devoted army. Sulla finally returned and marched on Rome a second time. This time, he won decisively. Sulla established himself as dictator, a temporary emergency ruler, and launched his famous proscriptions. These were lists of his enemies who could be killed legally by anyone and their property taken. Thousands were murdered. Sulla then tried to stabilize the Republic by strengthening the Senate, but the damage was done. He eventually retired, believing he had fixed Rome, but his example of using the army to seize power inspired every ambitious general who came after him. In the bloody and chaotic aftermath of the Marius and Sulla wars, one man tried to save the Republic using not an army, but the power of his voice. That man was Marcus Tullius Cicero, an orator and lawyer who rose from a non-noble family to become one of the most famous men in Rome. Cicero believed deeply in the old traditional laws and ideals of the Republic, and he used his incredible talent for speaking to fight for them. Cicero's primary weapon was oratory, the art of persuasive public speaking. In the Roman Forum, Cicero's voice was famous for its wit, its fire, and its passionate defense of justice. To be a great Roman leader, you had to be a great speaker, and Cicero was the master. His speeches were so powerful they could sway the Senate, convince a jury, and move the common people. Cicero rose to the highest office, becoming a consul in 63 BC. His most famous moment in office was uncovering and crushing the Catiline conspiracy. Catiline was a disgruntled, failed nobleman who planned to overthrow the government through a violent coup and civil war. Cicero stood before the Senate and delivered a blistering series of speeches, exposing Catiline's plans and forcing him to flee Rome. By stopping Catiline, Cicero believed he had saved the Republic. He was hailed as the Pater Patriae, the father of the fatherland. His greatest ambition was to create a united front between the Senate and the wealthy business class, which he called the Concord of the Orders, to work together to protect the Republic from ambitious generals. Cicero saw the growing power of military men as the death knell of the Republic. He argued fiercely that the law must always be superior to the sword. He wrote many famous works on philosophy, duty, and law, all of which survive and have profoundly influenced political thought in the centuries that followed. He established the ideal of the citizen statesman, who uses wisdom, not force. But the rise of military power was too great. Even Cicero, with his brilliant mind and powerful voice, could not stop the momentum of the ambitious generals. His refusal to align with these generals eventually made him a dangerous enemy. Though he tried to save the Republic by words, the time for words was ending, and the time for overwhelming force embodied by the greatest military figure of them all, Julius Caesar, was dawning. With the Republic staggering from civil war to political crisis, the most powerful men in Rome realized they could achieve more by working together than by following the old, slow rules of the Senate. In 60 BC, three immensely rich and powerful men formed a secret, unofficial alliance called the First Triumvirate, which literally means rule of three men. These three were the true rulers of Rome, not the Senate. The first man was Gnaeus Pompey Magnus, or Pompey the Great. He was Rome's most famous living general, a military hero who had crushed pirates and expanded Rome's power hugely in the East. He was respected by the Senate, but constantly frustrated by their slowness. He wanted land and money for his loyal veterans, and he needed the other two men to help him get it. The second was Marcus Licinius Crassus. He was the richest man in Rome, who had made his fortune buying up burning buildings and exploiting real estate. He famously crushed the massive slave revolt led by Spartacus. Crassus craved military glory and political power to match his wealth. He needed the others' support to gain military command. The third was Gaius Julius Caesar. He was the youngest, a nobleman with huge debts and extraordinary ambition. He was also a brilliant orator and a fierce politician who championed the common people. He needed the support of Pompey's popularity and Crassus's money to win the consulship and gain a lucrative military command to make his own name and fortune. The three men agreed to use their combined influence to get each other what they wanted, completely bypassing the will of the Senate. Caesar was elected consul and promptly used his power to pass Pompey's laws and give Crassus favorable business deals. Once his year as consul was over, Caesar secured a governorship that gave him command of 4 legions and the province of Gaul, modern France. This alliance secretly controlled Rome, but it was always uneasy. Pompey was jealous of Caesar's rising fame, and Crassus only cared about money and glory. The alliance was finally broken when Crassus went on a disastrous military campaign against the Parthian Empire in the east and was killed in battle. With Crassus gone, the two remaining giants, Caesar and Pompey, now faced each other, making a massive civil war inevitable. The Republic was about to face its ultimate test. After the Triumvirate, Julius Caesar spent 9 years away from Rome, leading his legions in the bloody conquest of Gaul, the massive territory that is now modern France, Belgium, and parts of Switzerland. These campaigns were a masterclass in military leadership, endurance, and strategy. Caesar, a brilliant writer as well as a general, meticulously recorded his victories in his famous Commentaries on the Gallic War. Caesar's victories brought immense wealth to Rome, enslaved 1 million people, and added a huge new territory to the empire. More importantly, they turned Caesar's army into an unstoppable, hardened fighting machine that adored him. They were the best soldiers Rome had ever fielded, and they were loyal to their general above the Senate. Caesar had achieved the fame and the military power he had always craved. Back in Rome, the Senate, led by his former ally Pompey, grew terrified of Caesar's popularity and power. They knew that if Caesar returned with his victorious army, he would be unstoppable. They ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen to face prosecution for illegal actions he took as consul. This was a trap designed to destroy him politically. Caesar knew that if he obeyed the Senate, he would lose everything. If he refused, he would be declaring war on the Republic. In January 49 BC, Caesar and one of his legions stood at the Rubicon River, a small stream that marked the boundary between his province and Italy proper. Crossing the Rubicon with an army was forbidden by Roman law and was an act of treason. After a long pause, Caesar famously uttered the Latin phrase, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast. He plunged into the water and his army followed. This moment, crossing the Rubicon, has become a phrase meaning reaching a point of no return. The civil war between Caesar and the Senate, led by Pompey, had begun. Caesar's speed and the loyalty of his troops were overwhelming. Pompey and the terrified Senate fled Italy to Greece, where they tried to gather a huge army. Caesar pursued them, and after a series of campaigns, he finally defeated Pompey at the Battle of Pharsalus. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was immediately assassinated by the local king, hoping to please Caesar. Caesar arrived shortly after, shocked and saddened by the murder of his former son-in-law, and he found himself the absolute, undisputed master of the Roman world. With all his enemies defeated, Julius Caesar returned to Rome in triumph. He was the most powerful man Rome had ever known, ruling as a dictator. Unlike the temporary dictatorship of Sulla, Caesar had himself declared dictator for life. He began sweeping, brilliant reforms, reorganizing the government, granting citizenship to more people, and reforming the calendar to the one we mostly use today. However, while the common people loved him, the traditional senators were terrified. They saw his power as a return to the hated monarchy, the very thing the Republic was founded to prevent. By making himself dictator for life, he had destroyed the system of annual elected magistrates, which was the core of the Republic. The whispers of conspiracy began immediately. The conspirators were a group of about 60 senators, led by Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus. Brutus was a descendant of the man who had supposedly expelled the last king of Rome, and he deeply believed he was acting to save the Republic from tyranny. The conspirators decided to strike on the Ides of March 15th, in 44 BC, when the Senate was meeting in a theatre complex. On the fateful morning, Caesar was warned multiple times, but he famously ignored the omens. As he entered the Senate, the conspirators swarmed him. They drew concealed daggers and began stabbing him repeatedly. Caesar initially tried to fight back, but when he saw his friend and protege Brutus among the attackers, he reportedly pulled his toga over his head and submitted to his fate. Caesar was stabbed 23 times and died right at the foot of a statue of his great rival Pompey. The conspirators, believing they had heroically restored liberty, rushed out to the forum to announce the death of the tyrant. They expected to be hailed as heroes, but the reaction was not what they planned. The common people, who loved Caesar, were furious, and the Senate was paralyzed. The murder, intended to save the Republic, plunged Rome into chaos and civil war once more. It proved that the Republic was already dead. The only thing left was a struggle between great individuals for control. Caesar's death was not the end of monarchy, but the beginning of a desperate fight for his inheritance. The key players who would fight for this legacy were his loyal general, Mark Antony, and his adopted son, Octavian. The assassination of Caesar left a huge power vacuum. The key figures who stepped into the chaos were Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal, popular general and friend, and Gaius Octavius, Caesar's 18-year-old great-nephew, whom Caesar had surprisingly named as his adopted son and heir in his will. Octavius, soon known as Octavian, was quiet, calculating, and lacked military experience, but he possessed Caesar's name and his money. Antony and Octavian initially clashed, but they soon realized they had a common enemy: the conspirators, Brutus and Cassius, and all those who still clung to the dream of the Republic. They joined with a third general, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, to form the Second Triumvirate, an official and legal dictatorship of 3 men. Their first act was to launch a bloody wave of proscriptions, killing thousands of their political enemies, including the orator Cicero, who had dared to speak out against Antony. The Triumvirate then hunted down Brutus and Cassius and defeated them decisively at the Battle of Philippi in Greece. The deaths of the conspirators marked the definitive, final end of the Roman Republic. The 3 men then divided the vast Roman world amongst themselves. Octavian took the West, Italy, Lepidus took Africa, who was quickly sidelined, and Antony took the wealthy, culturally rich East. Antony journeyed to Egypt, where he met Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt. Cleopatra was highly intelligent, charismatic, and an incredibly effective political ruler. Antony fell deeply in love with her, and, more importantly, with the massive wealth and resources of Egypt that she controlled. He began to live like an Eastern king, dressing in foreign robes and giving Roman land to Cleopatra and their children. Octavian, back in Rome, was quietly consolidating his power and turning the Roman people against Antony. He portrayed Antony as a weak figure, corrupted by an exotic foreign queen who intended to move the capital of the empire to Alexandria. Octavian was the defender of traditional Roman values and the true heir of Caesar. The final clash was inevitable, a battle for the soul of the Roman world. The final showdown came at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. It was a massive naval battle off the coast of Greece. Antony and Cleopatra were defeated. They fled back to Egypt, where Octavian soon followed. Realizing their cause was hopeless, Antony and Cleopatra both took their own lives. Octavian executed Cleopatra's son, Caesarion, and took control of Egypt, making it a Roman province. Octavian was now the sole master of the Roman world, with no rivals left. The age of the Republic was over, and the age of the emperors was beginning. After his victory, Octavian carefully avoided making the same mistake as his adoptive father Caesar. He knew that calling himself king or dictator would lead to assassination. Instead, he claimed he was simply restoring the Republic. In 27 BC, he made a show of giving up all his power to the Senate, which, having learned its lesson, immediately gave it all back to him, plus a new revered title, Augustus. The name Augustus means revered one. He officially remained a consul, a tribune, and a general, all at once. He was the princeps, the first citizen, but in reality, he was the first Roman emperor. He had cleverly disguised monarchy in the familiar clothing of the Republic. The civil wars were over, and the era of the Roman Empire had begun, ushering in 2 centuries of peace and prosperity. This golden age is known as the Pax Romana, or Roman peace. It lasted from the reign of Augustus until 180 AD. During this time, the vast empire, stretching from Britain to Egypt, experienced unprecedented stability. Trade flourished, roads were built, and the population grew. People felt secure because Augustus provided the 2 things Romans valued most: order and security. Augustus was a master builder. He famously boasted that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. He sponsored massive public works, building new temples, baths, and forums. He reformed the military, making it a fully professional standing army that served for 20 years. He also created the Praetorian Guard, an elite unit stationed in Rome, whose official purpose was to protect the emperor. Augustus was also a moral reformer. He passed laws encouraging marriage and having children, believing that the wars had corrupted Roman moral fiber. He supported great poets like Virgil, whose epic poem, the Aeneid, provided a mythical, glorious history for Rome, tying its founding to the fall of Troy and justifying the new empire. When Augustus died in 14 AD, he had successfully laid the foundation for an imperial system that would last for hundreds of years. His work ensured that Romans valued the peace and order of the emperor over the turbulent freedom of the Republic. He had solved the problem of the civil wars, but he left one difficult problem unsolved: how to peacefully transfer power. He had no sons, so he had to rely on adopting and naming his successor, starting the dynasty known as the Julio-Claudians. The dynasty founded by Augustus, known as the Julio-Claudians, included some of the most stable and some of the most scandalous emperors in Roman history. The first successor was Tiberius, Augustus's stepson. He was a brilliant general and an effective administrator, but he was also dark, suspicious, and unpopular. He eventually retired to the island of Capri, trying to rule from afar and relying heavily on the head of the Praetorian Guard. Tiberius was succeeded by his grandnephew Caligula. Caligula started his reign with promise, but he quickly became known for his shocking cruelty and madness. Stories claim he wanted to appoint his favorite horse, Incitatus, as a consul, and he wasted the imperial treasury on extravagant, ridiculous projects. His unstable behavior alienated the Senate and his own bodyguards, the Praetorian Guard. Caligula's tyranny was cut short when he was assassinated by the very Praetorian Guard, whose loyalty he had tested too far. Following the murder, the Guard literally found Caligula's uncle, Claudius, hiding behind a curtain and declared him emperor. Claudius was intellectual, highly educated, and physically awkward, often underestimated by everyone. Despite being underestimated, Claudius proved to be a very competent ruler. He was a great builder, constructing new aqueducts for Rome and improving the city's port. Most famously, he launched the successful Roman invasion and conquest of Britain in 43 AD, adding a valuable new province to the empire. He was a detail-oriented hard worker, yet his reign ended tragically when he was likely poisoned by his ambitious wife, Agrippina, to secure the throne for her son. That son was Nero, one of the most infamous Roman emperors. Nero was more interested in art, music, and chariot racing than in governance. He bankrupted the treasury with his artistic projects. His reign is best remembered for the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, which destroyed much of the city. While it's unclear if he started it, the rumor persisted that he fiddled while Rome burned. Nero blamed the fire on a small, new religious group called the Christians, launching the first major wave of imperial persecution against them. His increasing paranoia and tyranny finally led to a massive rebellion among his generals. Seeing no way out, Nero fled Rome and took his own life. His last words were supposedly, "What an artist dies in me." His death ended the Julio-Claudian dynasty and plunged Rome back into a brief, violent civil war, proving once again that succession was the empire's greatest weakness. Nero's death in 68 AD plunged the empire into a crisis known as the Year of the Four Emperors. In quick succession, 4 different generals claimed the throne, backed by their own armies. This was a brutal reminder that the army, not the Senate or the people, truly decided who ruled Rome. For a year, the stability of the Pax Romana was shattered as Rome witnessed the horror of constant political assassinations and civil war. The fourth and final contender to emerge victorious from the chaos was Titus Flavius Vespasianus, known simply as Vespasian. Vespasian was a career soldier from a relatively humble, non-noble background. When the fighting generals assassinated each other in Rome, Vespasian was in Judea, modern Israel, successfully commanding the Roman forces that were trying to crush a major Jewish revolt. Vespasian was a practical, hard-working, and slightly crude man. He restored order with firmness and brought stability back to the treasury, which had been emptied by Nero's excesses. He famously taxed public toilets, saying, "Money does not stink." His greatest achievement was securing the transfer of power, ensuring that his sons would succeed him, and establishing the stable Flavian dynasty. To cement his family's image as restorers of the empire and to erase the memory of Nero's tyranny, Vespasian began the construction of a massive, famous monument right in the heart of Rome. He decided to build a massive amphitheatre on the site of Nero's lavish private palace. This grand structure, built for the public, was originally called the Flavian Amphitheatre. This huge, iconic structure is, of course, better known today as the Colosseum. It was a massive gift to the Roman people, a venue for gladiatorial combat and public spectacles, providing the people with the bread and circuses they needed to stay happy and distracted from politics. The building work was completed by his son Titus. Titus succeeded his father and was well loved by the people, primarily for his benevolent character and his swift, organized response to the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, which tragically buried the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum. Titus was followed by his brother Domitian, who ruled effectively but autocratically. His paranoid, tyrannical style eventually led to his assassination. The Flavian dynasty ended, but Rome had learned a crucial lesson. The transfer of power needed a more stable, less hereditary method than bloodline. Following the assassination of the tyrannical Domitian, the Senate finally asserted itself and selected an older, non-dynastic successor, setting a new precedent. This began the era of the 5 good emperors, a period of nearly 100 years that is considered the peak of Roman power and prosperity. The new system was based on adoption. An emperor would wisely choose and formally adopt the best available man as his son and successor, ensuring a peaceful transition. The second of these emperors was Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117 AD. Trajan was Rome's first emperor who was not from Italy. He was born in Spain. He was a brilliant military man, a conqueror, and a great builder. Under his reign, the Roman Empire reached its greatest territorial extent. he successfully conquered the wealthy kingdom of Dacia, modern Romania, and briefly annexed parts of the Parthian Empire. After Trajan's death, his adopted son and successor, Hadrian, took over. Hadrian was a very different kind of emperor. He was a great traveler and a lover of Greek culture, but he was also a realist. He understood that Trajan's vast conquests in the east were too hard to hold, so he gave up the most distant territories to consolidate Roman power behind secure, defensible borders. Hadrian's most famous decision was to build the giant, defensive structure known as Hadrian's Wall across the northern border of Britain. This massive wall, stretching for 80 Roman miles, was not built to conquer, but to defend and clearly mark the boundaries of Roman civilization. It was a clear signal that the era of relentless expansion was over. Hadrian was also a tireless builder in Rome, supervising the construction of the magnificent Pantheon, a temple to all the gods, with its incredible, perfect dome. He traveled constantly, inspecting the legions and the provinces, and ensuring the quality of Roman governance everywhere. The era of the good emperors was the high point of Roman stability. The empire was rich, peaceful, and well-governed, but it was an artificial peace, built on the wisdom of the reigning emperor, a wisdom that would eventually run out. The last of the 5 good emperors was Marcus Aurelius, who reigned from 161 to 180 AD. He is perhaps the most famous because he was not just a successful ruler, but also a deep philosopher. Marcus Aurelius was a committed follower of Stoicism, a school of philosophy that taught the importance of duty, self-control, and accepting what you cannot change. Marcus Aurelius wrote a famous book called The Meditations, which was a collection of his personal reflections on duty, courage, and virtue. He never intended the book to be published, but it provides a window into the mind of a ruler struggling to be a good man while governing a massive, complex, and often cruel empire. He was truly the ideal of the philosopher king. Sadly, the peace and tranquility of the Pax Romana ended during his reign. Marcus Aurelius was forced to spend much of his time not in Rome, but on the northern frontier, fighting desperate wars against Germanic tribes called the Marcomanni and the Quadi. These were the first serious, large-scale threats to Rome's European borders since the time of Augustus. Compounding the military threat, a devastating event struck the empire. The Antonine Plague, likely a form of smallpox or measles brought back by Roman soldiers returning from the east, this plague swept across the entire Roman world, killing an estimated 5 to 10 million people. It severely weakened the army, devastated the economy, and created immense fear and chaos in the cities. Marcus Aurelius, despite his personal grief and the immense burden of the plague and the wars, faced these challenges with stoic calmness. He was a constant presence on the frontiers, leading his troops and enduring the same hardships as his soldiers. He raised new legions and even sold off imperial treasures to pay for the war effort, showing his deep commitment to the state. In a final, fateful decision, Marcus Aurelius broke the tradition of the good emperors. Instead of adopting the best man, he named his own highly flawed and unstable son, Commodus, as his successor. This move signaled the end of the system that had brought 80 years of peace. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180 AD, the empire had been battered by war and plague, and the throne was inherited by a reckless, unworthy heir. The age of gold was over, and the empire was about to descend into a period of deep, terrifying crisis. The reign of Marcus Aurelius's son, Commodus, was a disaster. He was vain, paranoid, and more obsessed with fighting in the arena as a gladiator than governing the vast empire. His misrule led to his assassination, plunging the Roman world into the worst crisis it had ever faced, the crisis of the 3rd century. This period, from 235 to 284 AD, was one of near-total collapse. The core of the crisis was political and military instability. In just under 50 years, there were 26 different emperors, and only one of them died of natural causes. The rest were assassinated by their own soldiers or defeated and killed in battle. These rulers are known as the barracks emperors because they were chosen and removed by the legions, often fighting each other in bloody civil wars instead of fighting Rome's enemies. The empire was also under relentless attack from all directions. In the west, fierce Germanic tribes like the Goths and Franks began breaking through the weakened frontiers. In the east, a powerful new Persian empire, the Sassanids, launched devastating attacks, even capturing a Roman emperor in battle. Rome no longer had a stable army to defend its borders. To make matters worse, the economy utterly collapsed. The emperors, needing money to pay the constantly demanding soldiers, began to debase the currency. This meant they melted down the silver coins and mixed the metal with cheap copper. The coins looked the same, but they were almost worthless. This caused hyperinflation. Prices soared so high that trade broke down, and people started trading goods instead of using money. The immense empire began to fragment. 3 separate regions actually declared themselves independent, forming the Gallic Empire in the west and the Palmyrene Empire in the east. For a time, it seemed the Roman Empire would break into 3 pieces. This period was marked by famine, plague, economic ruin, and constant fear. The empire survived this terrible century only through sheer resilience and the sacrifices of its soldiers. However, the old institutions of the Republic and the order of the Pax Romana were utterly gone. The empire was no longer a vast, prosperous state, but a brutal military dictatorship, constantly on the defensive. It was clear that to survive, the empire needed a radical, tough ruler to completely restructure the state and end the endless civil wars. From the deepest darkness of the 3rd century crisis, a strong, decisive leader finally emerged to save the Roman world, the Emperor Diocletian. A tough soldier from humble origins, Diocletian seized power in 284 AD and immediately realized that the massive empire was simply too big for one man to govern and too chaotic to secure alone. Diocletian's solution was radical. He divided the empire into 2 halves, east and west, and created a system of 4 rulers known as the Tetrarchy, meaning rule of 4. There would be 2 senior emperors, called Augusti, and 2 junior emperors, called Caesars, who would succeed the Augusti. This guaranteed that the empire would always have a clear, military-trained successor and would never depend on one man. This system successfully ended the Barracks Emperors period, stopping the cycle of civil war. However, it also created a permanent separation of the empire. The East, with its capital in the wealthy city of Nicomedia, was generally richer and more secure. The West, with its capital in Mediolanum, Milan, was poorer and faced the fiercer barbarian threats along the Rhine and Danube rivers. To fix the economy, Diocletian instituted sweeping, heavy-handed reforms. He tried to halt hyperinflation by issuing an edict on maximum prices, setting a fixed, maximum price for thousands of goods and wages. This ambitious attempt failed because it ignored market forces, leading to black markets and shortages, but it showed how desperate the state was. Diocletian also dramatically changed the nature of the emperor. He abandoned the old republican pretense of being the first citizen. He demanded to be worshipped as a god and adopted elaborate, heavy robes and ceremonies from the Persian courts. He even required people to prostrate themselves before him. The emperor was now an absolute, unapproachable monarch. In a final surprising act, Diocletian retired peacefully, forcing his co-Augustus Maximian to retire with him. The Tetrarchy worked, and the Caesars stepped up to become the new Augusti, demonstrating a successful, non-violent transfer of power. However, shortly after his retirement, the Tetrarchy broke down as the new rulers began fighting each other. The empire was saved from immediate collapse, but the seeds of new, massive civil wars were sown by the division itself. After Diocletian's retirement, the Tetrarchy system quickly dissolved into a brutal fight between the 4 new emperors. The ultimate winner of this struggle was Constantine, the son of one of the original Caesars. Constantine was a brilliant, decisive general who fought his way across the empire. His victory would not only reunite the empire, but also change its official religion forever. The pivotal moment of his rise came in 312 AD at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge near Rome. The night before the battle, Constantine claimed he had a vision of a Christian symbol, the Chi Rho, the first 2 letters of Christ in Greek, or heard the words, "In hoc signo vinces." In this sign you will conquer. He ordered his soldiers to paint the symbol on their shields. He won the battle decisively and became the sole ruler of the West. The following year, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan. This was a truly groundbreaking decree that legalized Christianity throughout the Roman Empire and ended the state persecution of Christians. After centuries of being a tiny, persecuted sect, the followers of Christ were now free to worship. Constantine himself did not ban the old Roman gods, but he strongly favored Christianity, building new churches and funding Christian projects. Constantine made one other massive decision that shaped the next 1,000 years of history. He founded a new capital city in the east. He chose the strategic, ancient Greek city of Byzantium on the Bosporus Strait, a perfect location controlling the flow of trade between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. He renamed it Constantinople, Constantine's city. The capital was officially moved from Rome to Constantinople in 330 AD. This move confirmed the shift in power and wealth from the struggling West to the secure, prosperous East. Rome remained the traditional heart of the empire, but Constantinople was the new political, military, and economic center. The empire was reunited under Constantine, but the West would forever play second fiddle to the East. Constantine ruled for over 30 years. He finally converted to Christianity on his deathbed, making him the first Roman emperor to embrace the faith. He left behind a newly Christianized empire, a fortified eastern capital, and a centralized government based on the model of Diocletian. He had given the empire a new religion and a new heart, but by cementing the division of power, he had also set the stage for the final, slow collapse of the western half. Following Constantine, the empire was often ruled by separate emperors in the east and west. The Eastern Empire was wealthy and strong, but the Western Empire was growing weaker, poorer, and increasingly unable to defend its long borders. The biggest factor in the West's decline was the constant movement of massive groups of people, often called the barbarians, pushing into Roman territory. This huge movement was triggered by the fearsome arrival of the Huns from Central Asia. These nomadic horsemen, led by their terrifying leader Attila, put pressure on the tribes already near the Roman frontier. These tribes, such as the Goths, Visigoths and Ostrogoths, and the Vandals, didn't initially want to destroy Rome. They often wanted to join the empire for safety and be paid to settle. But the Western Roman government was corrupt, badly managed, and broke the promises it made to these tribes. In 410 AD, the Visigoths, led by their king Alaric, had finally had enough and marched on Rome. For the first time in 800 years, the Eternal City was sacked, looted, and plundered. This event sent a massive psychological shockwave throughout the entire Roman world. Even worse was the arrival of Attila the Hun himself. Attila, known as the Scourge of God, led his armies into Gaul and Italy. In a crucial moment in 451 AD, the last great Roman general, Aetius, managed to ally with the Visigoths to defeat Attila in Gaul at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. This victory saved Western Europe from Hunnic domination. Attila died soon after, and his empire disintegrated. But the threats didn't stop. The Vandals seized North Africa and cut off Rome's main grain supply. They followed up by sailing to Rome and sacking it again in 455 AD, even more thoroughly than the Goths had. The Western Roman Empire was now a hollow shell, controlled by powerful barbarian generals who installed their own puppet emperors. The final end came simply and quietly. In 476 AD, the Germanic general Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a young boy ironically named Romulus Augustulus, Little Augustus. Odoacer sent the imperial symbols back to the emperor in Constantinople, declaring that the West no longer needed its own emperor. The Western Roman Empire was gone. The grand tale of Rome, from its mythic birth to its fall, was officially over in the West. The year 476 AD marks the traditional fall of Rome, but it's important to understand that only the western half of the empire had fallen. The Eastern Roman Empire, with its capital in Constantinople, was completely unharmed. This Eastern Roman Empire continued to thrive for another 1,000 years, until 1453 AD, long after the West had fractured into separate kingdoms. We know this continuation of the Roman state as the Byzantine Empire, named after the city's original name, Byzantium. The Byzantines never called themselves that. They always called themselves Romans. Their emperor was the direct successor to Augustus and Constantine. They preserved Roman law, military traditions, and engineering, all while speaking Greek and practicing Orthodox Christianity. The Byzantine Empire was a massive, essential shield for Western Europe, holding back powerful Eastern invaders for centuries. Its greatest achievement was the codification of Roman law by the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. This collection of legal principles, called the Corpus Juris Civilis, preserved the entire legacy of Roman jurisprudence and became the basis for law across most of Europe. Even in the chaotic Western lands, the Roman influence never truly died. The conquerors, the Germanic kings, often tried to rule like Roman emperors, using Roman titles, laws, and administrative systems. The language of Rome, Latin, evolved into the modern Romance languages, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian, and remains the basis for most English scientific and legal words. Roman engineering and architecture set the standard for 1,000 years. Roman roads, bridges, and aqueducts, structures of immense durability, can still be seen today. The concept of republics and senates inspired the founders of modern countries centuries later, proving the enduring power of Rome's political ideals. The story of Rome is a loop, from a small village born of blood and destiny, through centuries of law, conquest, golden prosperity, and finally, a slow, unstoppable decline. Yet its ideas of citizenship, justice, political structure, and even the Christian faith it eventually adopted survived its fall. The Roman Empire did not truly end, it simply evolved, leaving an eternal influence that continues to shape our world, our laws, and our language. The story of Rome is full of such dramatic twists, from mythical twins to powerful laws. If you found yourself sinking into sleep while listening to the foundation of the Roman Republic, please remember to like this video. Hitting the like button helps the Roman story reach more tired minds, looking for a historical journey to guide them to rest. And if you'd like to continue this journey through the world of ancient power and legendary figures, be sure to subscribe to History for the Tired. Next time, we move beyond the hills to see how Rome began to dominate all of Italy. Thank you for joining us tonight. The walls of Rome are secure, the Senate is quiet, and the Tiber River flows gently under the light of the moon. Sleep well, let the weight of the ancient world fade away, and rest deeply. We'll continue the march of the legions when you wake. Good night.